She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care.
Again everyone, it's Melbourne Games Coach, and this time it's episode 4 of Ticket to Ride, my 4th round game from the Ryde-Eastwood Open held earlier this month. This time I'm black against another ACT player, Matthew Bennett. ACF rating 1758, his FIDE rating 1762. And it starts off as a D4. I'm playing my modern defense again. And after d5, I play bishop takes c3 check, which is known variously as the broken arrow, the Cinzi Indian. I've also seen it referred to as the beef eater and the chaos counterattack. I won't go into too much detail in terms of the theory, at least in terms of this video, because I plan to in the future come up with basically a series on this opening and looking at it in a bit of detail. So after b takes c3, I like to play queen a5. Matthew played queen c2 to protect the c3 pawn. Then I play f5, and a large part of the opening is developed around this key e4 square and who gets control of it. White plays knight f3, just developing. d6, a logical sort of developing move. Now my knight's going to get out to d7 and then either to e5 or b6. It's also going to stop the pawn from potentially playing to d6, which might happen in lines when the queen's on d1. Not so much when the queen's on c2, however. Bishop d2 to overprotect the c3 pawn, so now this might make e4 a possible break for white, now that the queen is not tied down to the defense of c3 square. So logically, to stop that, knight f6, and white decides to fianchetto his bishop by playing g3. And this is the type of system that I've been playing quite a bit lately, and the type of position that a lot of white players play. I've had this sort of position fairly often, and this is part of the reason why I'm looking to make the video series in the future. Needless to say that I actually think this position is really, really good for black, in spite of what some people might think are the sort of concessions on the king side, the lack of dark squared bishop and the potential sort of weakness of squares like g5 and h6 and g7. It's not very easy for white to do anything to exploit those weaknesses, and that's counterbalanced by obviously the weak pawns on the queen side for white, the c4 and c3 pawns. And the complication here for white is that this weakness here, the double pawns, they're fixed by the c5 pawn. That holds that up. There's no pawn breaks because the pawn's on d5. So this weakness over here is a static weakness. It can't be moved. It's fixed. The weaknesses over here on the king side may not remain that way for the whole game. They could be irrelevant, but black's always got these targets on the queen side to go after. So continuing with the game, I played knight d7. And this seems to, at least temporarily, give up what looks like a key square, e6. So Matthew plays something that seems fairly natural, knight g5, trying to head for that e6 square. And I respond pretty simply with knight into e5. Obviously we're threatening one of those weak c pawns. It's not that easy to defend. Obviously the way that Matthew ends up choosing isn't the greatest, but we've got the bishop to cover the e6 square if need be, and even if the knight does get into e6, apart from playing a check on g7, it doesn't really achieve much. I'm not overly concerned with the centre being blocked, that my king sort of needs to castle one side or the other. So I'm more than happy to just leave my king in the centre for the time being, even if there is a knight sort of sitting in there in the sort of the big octopus 6th rank position that you might in other situations be very scared of. Here I don't think it's such a worry. So after knight e5, there's a big problem of what to do with a c-pawn. I think the most logical option would be to play queen b3. It also helps tie down the bishop to some extent, at least, to the b-pawn. However, Matthew decided to play e3, and now we have the problem that there is... Yes, I have the weaknesses on the dark squares over here on my king side. The problem is that these are now counterbalanced by weak white squares. You've got the bishop that needs to now stay on this diagonal to guard the c-pawn, and in particular this f3 square is a big weakness. So I played h6, the logical move to get rid of the knight. And tactically, this works out fantastically for me. It's very difficult to defend because of this knight f3 idea, and then the other knight can come into e4. So if, for example, Matthew tried something like knight h3, retreating the knight that way, I have knight f3 check, or at least this is what I was planning to play. King either e2 or d1, it doesn't really matter, and then simply taking on d2, either recapturing with the king or queen. It's not really an issue. I mean, if the king wants to end up going up to d3, so knight e4, queen moves again, and then just take on c3. And I was going to look at having this position, where again you've still got the c4 pawn, it's still fixed, you've still got the bishop on the white square that reduces its scope significantly, and this black knight is really going to dominate this white knight. Even if we manage to get the knight into f4 to attack this potentially weak pawn on g6, simply king f7 seems to hold everything. So this is what I would have been more than happy to go with if Matthew played a move like knight h3. However, he chose f4. I'm more than happy to take on g5 and win the pawn. And then he decided to play bishop d3. Interesting choice here. The problem with doing this is that it actually allows me to basically bury his bishops for pretty much the whole game. I get to play e4 here, obviously threatening the bishop goes back to e2, and now I play g4. We have, obviously, these pawns on the 3rd rank at the moment are all fixed on black squares, so this black bishop is pretty much useless. It's really got no future, and even if it does, let's say, get out to a3 somehow, all it's doing is attacking the c pawn, and then I can just play b6, protect the b pawn, and the bishop still has nothing to do. So the key to all this is that this d2 bishop is basically killed, and also this bishop on e2, the white squared bishop, again with the black pawns here, doesn't really have any future on the king side or in the center. So the only sort of really possible way they can get out is sort of, again, over to the a file. And again, I have a simple remedy to all this. I can just play bishop d7 before it gets to a4, and I've again stopped any kind of attacking ideas that the bishop might have. I've also, yes, my bishop isn't great either, but my key piece in this position is my knight on f6, and the obvious plan for me is to get it into this key e5 square. Obviously, it's from there it's got threats on c4 all the time. That's again another weakness. You've also got to watch out for, if this bishop ever leaves e2, jumping into d3 or f3, and possibly even jumping into f3 anyway. I'm more than happy to recapture either, depending on where the white king goes, either with the g pawn or the f pawn. If the bishop swaps the knight on f3, and I basically have all the play. I've got the semi-open h-file that I can work down, so possibly later on I could castle queenside, double up on the h-file and play down the h-file here against this weak h2 pawn. So already we're only 15 moves in, and strategically I think the game is basically won for black. It's just a matter of then converting it. So from here, white played rook b1. Again, pretty simple response to it, just play b6. An alternative that might have been better, I could have also played knight d7 and sort of head for e5 as soon as possible, but I was happy to just sit with b6 and just make sure that any kind of weakness I might have, or any kind of potential attack, was just taken away before it even got started. Now white castle, so now instead of having just a weak pawn, I've got a king as a target down the h-file if I want to get there eventually. Bishop d7, rook b2, and queen a6. This is a multi-purpose move. Couple of things here. I might be looking to reposition the queen, possibly to get it over to the king side at some stage. a6, it also threatens or keeps an eye on the c4 pawn. It can also help, obviously was already doing that, but it's another useful square to maybe help, say, a bishop a4 idea or something like that, because obviously I want to clear the bishop at some stage so that this knight can move and maneuver back around to the big e5 square that I'm aiming for. And again, from e5 it's also got that eye on the c4 square, so it's a useful move. I also might want to, depending on what white does, if white tries to maybe play a4 and a5 early, I might be able to maybe just play a5 and try and stop the play that way, so that again maybe there's sort of only one target, if at all, for white to aim at. White decided to play rook a1, so it's pretty obvious that his plan is going to involve playing a4, and I probably should have played bishop a4 at this point in time, just to stop all that. It's a useful move again because of that knight maneuver idea. I just thought it'd be better to basically keep the pieces on in this position, just because it's going to cramp up white's position even further. My pieces can do what they like pretty much. Again, there's nothing stopping the knight from ever coming to the big e5 square. No, I have sort of nothing stopping me from sort of doubling up on the h-file pretty quickly with the rook, so just simply say king f7, say rook h7 and the other rook over to the h-file, and pretty easily I can develop an attack on the king side. So bishop a4 really would have just killed everything as far as white's potential attack. The only thing I was maybe concerned about might have been a situation where he might have been able to give up an exchange, maybe at some stage playing a rook b5. But even then, I mean, there's no reason to even take the exchange, even in that sort of position. I can just leave all the files closed and just sort of work on my own plans. Having said that, instead of playing bishop a4, I went for the tactical approach, and I saw that, again, the other useful point of queen a6 was that it pinned the c4 pawn to this bishop on e2. So I played knight takes d5. I think because of the weaknesses of the kingside position and the fact that his castle and the rook's already on this semi-open h-file, taking on d5 and allowing queen takes e2 really wasn't something that Matthew was really considering seriously. So yeah, it's essentially a free pawn. Played a4, logical kind of follow-up, I suppose. I've just dropped the knight back to c7. I realise this is a change of plan for me, but I still have, obviously from c7, I have sort of the knight helping keep watch on the queen side, but if need be I can still get back to the e5 square in a reasonable sort of timely manner, or alternatively, instead of going for the e5 square, I can actually head over to the g5 square, where I'm aiming at h3 and f3. So rather than aiming for d3 and c4, f3 and h3 can be my targets with a knight on g4. And again, this pressure down the h file is going to be a big problem for white to try and defend. a5 is a logical attempt to try and break things up. I simply captured queen b3, and I was followed up. Here I think I was a bit sort of overly concerned about one idea, to some extent I guess to the detriment of everything else. The only thing I really considered for white in this position was the idea of playing queen b7, and then potentially at least getting a rook on b7, which if nothing else would be a bit annoying. So I thought, trying to stop that, to play bishop c6. The issue with that is that, as Matthew played in the game, queen a3, obviously now there's a double attack on the pawns on a5 and c5. The critical one, as far as I'm concerned, is the pawn on c5, so I need to play knight e6 to protect that. Matthew recaptured the pawn on a5, and that's nothing to worry about as far as I was concerned. Although now he does get some pressure down the a file, which is obviously a slight concern, but I thought for a couple of reasons that not only in terms of positional sense, but tactically I had enough time to defend everything on the queen side. Rook f7 and king f7 and rook a2 seem pretty logical, and then the tactical shot that I have here is the h rook, so swinging away from the queen side over to b8. The point being that if he ever takes on h7, I'm happy to swap rooks and then play rook b2, and I'm going to win one of these bishops, given that they're both on the second rank. So to stop that, Matthew played king f2, so he's now threatening to take on a7. Obviously if the swap happens and the rook comes down to b2, he can simply play king e1 and protect that d2 bishop. So given that I'd actually saved the move, I have time for rook b7, so I've now sufficiently protected my a pawn. Now he's played bishop c1. Again, a logical move, trying to get to the second weakness in my position, that c5 pawn. So I've played rook c7, preparing to just move the bishop out of the way, so I've got two defenders on it, my knight on e6 and the rook on c7. Let's play rook d1, and again, similar kind of tactic to that one before. It's allowed me to get my rook out from a8 to be a bit more active, so I can play rook b8. Again, the idea being that tactically I have rook b1 at the end of the combination if white ever plays rook takes a7. So bishop a4. Obviously I'm happy to swap the bishops. The big thing in this position is that my knight is so much better than the black squared bishop, again because of these horrible pawns that we looked at before that are all fixed, g3, e3 and c3, and that makes this bishop on the dark squares almost useless. It really has no scope at all. So happy to swap bishops. Brought the rook down to b3 to attack that weak c pawn. Again, I don't mind if he wants to swap the a pawn. I'm going to pick up both the c pawns for that, and again I've got the good knight against the bad bishop in the ending. So bishop d2 to prevent all that. Rook d2, again another tactical shot on the bishop. If he'd moved the king across, I was more than happy to just bring the rook back to b7, just to help protect that pawn. Then my plan from that point was to basically overprotect the a pawn, so that that'd free my rook up. So the idea being, from then, if let's say, I don't know, he played a line like king here, my plan is to then play rook back and overprotect my weak pawn here. Simple plan of just doing it with the king. Again, my king over to the b8 square. Once it's there, obviously I'll have one rook and the king protecting the b pawn, and then this rook is then free to act down sort of the b file wherever it wants to. Maybe b3, b2, b1, any of these key squares that'll be really useful for the rook. And also, given that he can really only attack the c pawn once, this knight then has that idea to that plan of coming into maybe f3. So that was the plan if he just defended with king e1. However, instead of doing that, he decided to play rook a2. As I suggested earlier, I'm more than happy to swap, and given that I don't have any pressure on the c pawn, I can see that shortly the one sort of active option for this bishop, sort of bishop c1 and bishop a3, and trying to put pressure on the c5 pawn. What I wanted to do, so that I could sort of untangle my pieces, rather than having this knight on the d7 square, sorry, the e6 square, I actually want it on the d7 square, and I want that square, which keeps an eye on c5, again also has that potential for the big square on e3, and then sort of jumping into f3 and d3. Plus, if there's ever any problems on the 6th rank from, say, a rook, I can simply push the pawn on e6 and maneuver my king around to help protect that. So this was the sort of the idea that I had here behind my next move, which was knight f8. So I'm going to re-maneuver the knight to a better square on d7 where it's more flexible. It might also come to b6 at some stage, which I actually did a bit later, but this is the idea. So he played rook a5 again to try and attack that c5 pawn, knight d7 to overprotect it, rook c1, and now king e6, bishop a3, king d6. So again, by having the pawn on c5 protected 3 times, that means that I can move any one of those pieces at any stage, and obviously the pawn on c5 is still protected, so I can move the rook away, I can move the knight away, and not have to worry about losing that c pawn for nothing. So he tried rook a6. Again, this idea that if the king moves up to e5, he can sort of take on g5, and he might be able to get some play over here on the king side. So simply knight b6. Now I'm attacking the c pawn, although obviously I have to break the pin first. So king e2, king d7, which is where I wanted my king to get to anyway. Then he played rook a5, and I simply took on c4. And again, I've got some pretty simple options. I don't need to actually swap the knight for the bishop if I want to. I can still re-maneuver the knight back to, again, these huge squares, e5, f3, or d3. I might even have, say, a pawn break like e5 and look to play f4. And again, white really has no play in the position either. So this is where Matthew chose to resign. And yeah, thanks again for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and this will be one of the something of an introduction to a future series that we'll have on that line of the modern defence. So see you next time.